I think one of the things I've picked up from today, looking at the questions that people have been texting through, there's that question of, what does success look like? What's the goal? Where are we trying to get to? And I'd like to bounce back to a story from my own life when it comes to what is a goal. This is me as a child in Derbyshire, where I grew up as far away from the sea as you can possibly get in the UK. And I had the chance, aged 4 years old, to sail for the first time. I could not believe the feeling of freedom that I felt when those sails were hoisted. It was incredible. It fascinated me. And then I made the decision that one day I was going to sail around the world. I had absolutely no idea how I would make that happen, but I knew exactly where I was going. And I began how I could. I started saving my birthday and Christmas money when I was 8 years old. When I went to secondary school, aged 11, every single day at school I had mashed potato and baked beans, which cost 4p each. So I could save the rest of my money and put it in the money box at the end of every day to one day save up for that boat. And that journey was extraordinary. I realized I needed money, I realized I needed sponsorship, but having a destination gave me a journey. I left school aged 17 in 1994. In 1995, I sailed solo around Great Britain. 96, my first transatlantic. 97, my first transatlantic solo. 1998, the big year. The year I could prove myself and find a sponsor. And I began a slightly different journey to find the funding. And I wrote 2,000 letters over the period of those 3 years and got 2 replies, trying to find a sponsor to make that dream, that goal, come true. And one day, through conversations, I got into a boardroom. I was sitting there in front of the CEO, and I was absolutely petrified. My knees were knocking, my mouth was dry, and I talked to him about my dream. I talked to him about my dream of sailing around the world. And after proving myself with a small amount of funding from that company, we set about just 1 year later to build Kingfisher, a 60-foot boat on which I would sail solo non-stop around the world. It was a hugely successful sponsorship which lasted for 8 years, and many people would come up and they'd go, "Kingfisher was so lucky to sponsor you." And I'd think to myself, that wasn't luck. They took a risk. They made a decision to sponsor a 21-year-old girl who had very little track record because they believed in her. Now let me take you into that world of racing around the world. Believe it or not, that was a good day's sailing. Fast, wet, exhilarating, and that is day and night. 24 hours a day you're on that boat, non-stop. You see amazing things like icebergs. I took that photograph. I could have sailed Kingfisher into those caves were so big, and they're still there at night, though at night, funnily enough, you don't ever see one. And that journey was everything I ever dreamt of. In the middle of an ocean, isolated in the Southern Ocean, 2,500 miles away from the nearest town. 5 days from help if you need to get off the boat for any reason. You can't get off, there's nobody who lives there. But it was everything I dreamt of, and more. And within 6 months of crossing that finish line, second in the Vendée Globe, I decided to go around the world again, the second time, to try and be the fastest person ever to sail non-stop solo around the world, and that needed a different boat. The trimarans are renowned for their speed, but also for their crashes. These kind of catastrophes, when they spin upside down, happen in just 5 seconds, and I know that very well because I was one of the 5 crew on this boat, which was one of my training sails for going around the world. 5 seconds, your world goes black because all the windows are underwater. Just 5 seconds. So when I crossed that successful start line, to try to be the fastest person ever solo non-stop around the world, the bar was high. The record to beat was 72 days. I achieved it in 71 days, 14 hours, 18 minutes, and 33 seconds. And I never ever thought I'd stop, because that was everything I dreamt of. It's all I'd ever wanted to do in my life since I was 4 years old. But I did stop. I stopped because on that boat, you manage a little world. What you have with you on that boat is all you have. 2,500 miles away from the nearest town is the closest shop. If you run out, there is no more. And you understand, for me, for the first time in my life, the real definition of the word finite. And I stepped off the boat and began a new journey. A strange journey for me into an area I knew nothing about, trying to learn, how do we use our resources? How do we use our world's resources? I remember picking up the 2008 IEA report during this journey of speaking to experts, scientists, CEOs, specialists. How do we use resources? The IEA report said we've got about 40 years of conventional oil left. And no one can put a figure on that time exactly. But what struck me was no one makes it anymore. Same with materials, the 2008 New Scientist report. How many years of materials do we have left? 60 for copper, 40, 41 for zinc and tin, 59 even for uranium, phosphorus, used for so much fertilizer across the world. And to put things in perspective when it comes to resources, the average EU car manufacturer in the last 12 months saw an increase in their raw material costs by 500 million euros. Half their operating profits wiped out by something they have no control over. And for me, it was this resources that was digging away. Energy, resources, water, food, all these things are linked. They're also finite. And we've seen a century of price declines effectively erased in a decade as our demand has increased. It's increased because we have a greater population, we have developing countries developing, and we're using these materials, we're using these finite materials in a faster and faster way. Our current economy relies on cheap energy and cheap materials. We take something out of the ground, we make something out of it, and at the end of its life, we generally throw it away. That process is beginning to change because those materials and that energy is getting more and more expensive. So what's our strategy? If that's how we make our money through the majority of manufacturing and our economy, what's our strategy? Well, our strategy seemed to be, when I was speaking to these experts, to take a bit less, make a bit more out of it, and throw a little bit less away. But where does that actually get you? We've heard today many times people speaking about prolonging the amounts of these resources that we have, making them last that bit longer, but we end up in the same place, just further down the line. And is that the goal? Is it the goal to end up with nothing, ultimately, because we've used it all up through this linear system? So that question, where are we actually trying to get to? Imagine a carpet that is designed for disassembly, that by intention, at its conception, is designed so that it returns to its manufacturer and it can be disassembled, it can be turned into its constituent parts, put into the next carpet. So the yarn gets depolymerized, repolymerized, and becomes the yarn of the next carpet. The base gets melted down and becomes the base of the next carpet. Those materials can continuously cycle. That material can continually be used. Now that company exists, and their goal is to use entirely renewable energy by 2025. Now, why would you do that? Because you know your costs for the next 25 years, in a world where energy and materials are getting increasingly expensive. How about FMCG, packaging, food, human waste? We have a huge issue with farming, with that phosphorus, with those nutrients we need to get back to the farmland. What if we redesign that system? What if that FMCG system was redesigned so that supermarket waste, food waste, human waste could re-enter that cycle and go back to the farmland where it can grow the food for tomorrow, and then go back to the farmland to recreate that cycle? And in fact, we're looking at two types of nutrients: biological nutrients for food and farming, and the technical nutrients that would sit within the carpet or your car. What design brief for a car says on its first line, we need this vehicle to be designed for disassembly. We need to be able to recover the materials so that we can put them into the next vehicle. And when you start to look at that and you realize the car will come back, you start to look at remanufacturing, you start to look at different business models, you start to look at buying performance rather than buying the vehicle itself, because the manufacturer needs that vehicle back. We just want the service. We don't need to own 100 cars that we've used within our lifetime sitting on our drive. We want mobility. You start to look at entirely different ways of doing things. And that's the circular economy. It's a framework for design that inspires innovation and creativity. It's a framework for redesigning and rethinking the future that decouples growth from those resource constraints, from those finite resources. The circular economy is a different way of looking at the entire system, not just products and materials, but the system within which we live, so that we can cycle those materials and create an economy, a whole global economy, because it's the economy, ultimately, the whole economy, which has to shift to an economy that can run in the long term. And it was with that idea 18 months ago that we launched the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, an NGO with the goal to accelerate the transition towards a circular economy. And we work in 3 areas. We work with education. We work with 14 to 19 education, because when young people see there's a different way to do things, they grab it with both hands. They are so creative, so innovative. They see there's a future that can have jobs, innovation, creativity, money, growth, income. And we also work with higher education and research. We work on communication to accelerate the transition through arriving at a tipping point. And we work with business in 2 areas. In business, we work with organizations to demonstrate how this model can work at scale. And we also work on trying to address some of the challenges in accelerating this transition. And one of the key things that we've done since we launched just 18 months ago was we commissioned a report into the economic opportunities of a circular economy. We went to McKinsey for the analytics, and through the writing of the report, we worked with experts, key thought leaders like Michael Braungart, you heard speak today here. Also, we worked with key businesses, innovative businesses, businesses driving this, businesses thinking very, very differently. And all we wanted was to put a number on this. So the idea of cycling these materials and running that on renewable energy works. It's a different economy. It creates many, many opportunities. But what numbers are on that? Is it now? Is it 5 years? Is it 10 years? Is it not at all? And what we discovered was extraordinary, staggering, that the transition to a circular economy has an economic opportunity worth $630 billion for the EU alone, and that's only based on a 48.7% subset of EU manufacturing and based on cycling 25% of materials in those products just once. That's a per annum figure by 2025. But this is a global opportunity to do things differently for both developed and developing worlds. And to see those figures was a very big step along this journey. And I'd like to leave you with a story to finish, to go back to that what is the goal. With our work in education, we work with young people. And we've been developing some materials around design and technology so that young people would think differently. And we'd worked with a very, very good teacher in the UK. Now, he'd been talking to his pupils about the circular economy, and he had one pupil come up to him. And this pupil said, "Sir, when I did my exams 2 years ago, I loved D&T, but I couldn't think of anything to design. But now having learnt about the circular economy, everything I see I want to redesign." And that's the power of knowing where you want to get to. Thank you.